There is a moment in life when everything becomes too heavy. Not because life is cruel, but because you have stopped being gentle with yourself. There is a quiet habit that shapes the entire direction of a person's life, and most people never notice it. It is the way you speak to yourself when no one is listening. Long before anyone else judges you, you have already judged yourself. Long before the world defines you, you have already, clear throat, built a definition inside your own mind. And if that inner voice becomes harsh, strict, and constantly critical, then even the smallest mistake starts to feel like a disaster. Even the smallest failure starts to feel like proof that something is wrong with you. This is how people slowly begin to lose kindness toward themselves without even realizing it. When someone starts to speak to themselves with harsh criticism, clears throat, it rarely begins as something extreme. It starts in small moments. A mistake at work, a wrong decision in a conversation, a missed opportunity. Instead of saying, I made a mistake, the mind starts saying, I am a mistake. That difference seems small, but it changes everything, because one statement focuses on action, while the other attaches identity. And once your identity becomes tied to your mistakes, snorts, every situation becomes heavier than it needs to be. This kind of inner dialogue creates a pressure that never turns off. Even when you are resting, your thoughts continue to attack you. Even when you are trying to move forward, your mind pulls you back into old situations, replaying them again and again like a punishment that never ends. You start expecting perfection from yourself in every situation, and when perfection is not achieved, the criticism becomes louder. It does not allow space for learning, only space for judgment over time. This harsh voice begins to feel normal. You stop noticing how often you put yourself down. You start believing that being strict with yourself is the only way to succeed, that kindness towards yourself will make you weak or careless. But the truth is completely opposite. A mind that is constantly under attack loses clarity. It becomes tired, tense, and unable to think freely. Instead of improving performance, harsh self-criticism slowly reduces confidence and creativity. People often believe that pushing themselves through negative self-talk will lead to better results. But what actually happens is internal resistance. The more pressure you apply on yourself emotionally, the more your mind begins to resist change. You may still move forward, but without peace, without balance, and without a sense of stability. Progress becomes something painful instead of something natural. There is also a deeper effect that happens quietly. When you are constantly critical of yourself, you begin to assume that others are also judging you in the same way. You start projecting your inner voice onto the world. A small comment from someone feels like a major criticism. A neutral reaction feels like rejection because internally you have already created an environment where judgment is constant. Breaking this pattern does not mean ignoring your mistakes or avoiding responsibility. It means changing the tone in which you correct yourself. It means separating who you are from what you did. You are not defined by a single moment, a single decision, or a single failure. You're a person who is capable of learning, adjusting, and growing, but only if the environment inside your mind allows that growth to happen. When you begin to notice the way you speak to yourself, even slightly, something important starts to shift. You become aware that you have been too harsh, too quick to judge, too slow to understand your own human nature. And in that awareness, the possibility of change begins to appear quietly, not through force, but through understanding. Mistakes are often treated like enemies in the mind, something to be avoided at all costs, something that must never happen if you want to be successful or respected. But in reality, mistakes are not the opposite of growth. They are part of the structure of growth itself. No one learns anything meaningful without going through moments of confusion, failure, correction, and adjustment. Yet most people struggle to accept this simple truth because they are taught, directly or indirectly, that being wrong is a sign of weakness rather than a natural part of learning. When a person cannot accept that mistakes are part of learning, every small error begins to feel like a threat to their identity. Instead of seeing a mistake as an event, they see it as a reflection of their worth. This creates unnecessary pressure where even simple decisions become stressful because the fear of getting something wrong becomes stronger than the desire to try. And when fear becomes stronger than curiosity, learning slows down, sometimes completely stops. A person in this state often begins to avoid new experiences. They hesitate before speaking, before acting, before making decisions. Not because they lack ability, but because they are afraid of how they will judge themselves if the outcome is not perfect. This fear builds slowly over time until life feels smaller than it actually is. Triceps snorts, Totos opportunities are missed, not because they were too difficult, but because the mind was too afraid of imperfection. Accepting that mistakes are part of learning changes this entire inner structure. It removes the heavy emotional weight attached to failure. Instead of seeing a mistake as something final, you begin to see it as feedback. Something that shows what needs adjustment, not something that defines who you are. This shift creates space for experimentation. And experimentation is the foundation of real growth. Every skill you admire in others today was once unrefined. Every confident person once struggled. Every expert once made repeated errors. The difference is not that they avoided mistakes, but that they allowed themselves to make them without turning them into identity. They corrected, adjusted, and continued without stopping their progress every time something went wrong. When mistakes are accepted as part of learning, the mind becomes lighter. There is less fear in action, less hesitation in decision-making, and more willingness to try again after failure. This does not remove responsibility. Instead, it removes unnecessary self-punishment. You still learn from what went wrong, but you do not attack yourself in the process. Self-kindness becomes possible only when this understanding is clear. Because if you believe that mistakes are unacceptable, you will always treat yourself with pressure and judgment. But if you understand that mistakes are natural, you begin to respond to yourself with patience. You stop asking why you failed as if failure is unnatural, and start asking what can be learned from what happened. This approach also changes the emotional experience of life. Instead of living in constant fear of getting things wrong, you begin to experience life as a process of exploration. You become more open, more flexible, and more willing to grow through experience rather than avoidance. Even difficult moments become easier to handle because they are no longer seen as personal defects, but as part of a larger process of development over time. This acceptance creates stability in the mind. You stop overreacting to every small mistake. You stop collapsing under pressure. You begin to recover faster after setbacks because you no longer attach your worth to every outcome. And in that space of acceptance, learning becomes continuous instead of interrupted, and growth becomes a natural direction rather than a forced effort. The way a person speaks to themselves is not just language, it becomes their inner environment. Every thought you repeat inside your mind slowly builds the emotional atmosphere in which you live. If that environment is filled with criticism, pressure, and judgment, then even simple moments begin to feel heavy. But when the inner voice becomes supportive, even difficult situations become easier to face. This is why replacing negative self-talk with supportive words is not just a positive habit, it is a necessary shift for mental stability and emotional balance. Negative self-talk often appears automatically. It does not wait for permission. A small mistake happens and immediately the mind reacts with statements like, "I can't do anything right," or "this always happens to me." These thoughts feel natural because they have been repeated many times before. The mind learns patterns, and once a pattern is formed, it repeats it without questioning whether it is true or helpful. Over time, this repetition becomes an internal voice that feels like reality. When a person continues to accept these thoughts without challenge, they slowly begin to believe them. And once they are believed, they start shaping behavior. A person who constantly tells themselves that they are not capable will begin to hesitate before trying. A person who repeatedly thinks they will fail will start avoiding opportunities. In this way, thoughts do not remain thoughts, they turn into limitations. Replacing negative self-talk does not mean ignoring reality or pretending that problems do not exist. It means changing the direction of your inner response. Instead of confirming failure, you begin to guide yourself through it. Instead of attacking yourself, you begin to support yourself through the process. This shift does not remove challenges, but it changes your relationship with them. When the mind says, "I always fail," you learn to respond with, "I am still learning." When it says, "I am not good enough," you begin to answer with, "I am improving step by step." When it says, "This is impossible for me," you start to remind yourself, "I can learn how to do this." These responses are not artificial positivity. They are grounded corrections that bring balance back into thinking. At first, this change feels unnatural because the mind is used to repetition. It resists new patterns because old ones feel familiar. But with consistent practice, the new way of speaking begins to replace the old one. the brain slowly starts to adopt a different default response. Instead of immediate criticism, there is now space for understanding. Instead of automatic judgment, there is room for support. This shift also affects emotional energy. Negative self-talk drains energy because it creates internal conflict. It makes you feel like you are constantly fighting yourself. Supportive self-talk, on the other hand, reduces internal tension. It does not eliminate challenges, but it prevents the mind from becoming an additional source of struggle. Life is already full of external pressure, and removing internal pressure creates a noticeable difference in how situations are experienced over time. Replacing negative self-talk builds resilience, not because problems disappear, but because your response becomes more stable. You stop collapsing under pressure as quickly. You recover faster from setbacks. You begin to see challenges as situations to navigate rather than judgments about your worth. And in that shift, confidence is no longer something that depends on outcomes, but something that grows from within through the way you continuously choose to speak to or clear throat yourself in difficult moments. Rest is one of the most misunderstood parts of human life. Tross and snorts, tross. Many people treat rest as something that must be earned only after exhaustion, as if they need to reach a certain level of tiredness before they are allowed to pause. This belief creates a silent pressure that follows them everywhere. Even when the body is tired, the mind refuses to accept rest without guilt. Even when energy is low, there is an inner voice saying, there is still more to do, still more to prove, still more to finish. Allowing yourself to rest without guilt is not laziness. It is not weakness. It is a recognition that human energy is not unlimited, and that recovery is part of productivity, not separate from it. Just like the body needs sleep to snortsy function, the mind needs pauses to remain clear. Without rest, both physical and mental systems begin to slow down. Not because they are weak, but because they are overloaded. When a person does not allow themselves to rest, the mind begins to operate under constant pressure. Every task feels heavier than it actually is. Every responsibility feels like a burden instead of a normal part of life. This is not because life has become more difficult, but because the internal system has not been given space to recover. Over time, this leads to exhaustion that is not only physical, but emotional and mental as well. Guilt during rest often comes from internal expectations that are too strict. The mind creates an idea that worth is connected to constant action, that stopping means falling behind, that pausing means failure. But this is not how human functioning works. Growth does not happen only during effort. It also happens during recovery. In moments of rest, the mind processes information, the body repairs itself. Twar snorts, thought and clarity begins to return naturally. When guilt is removed from rest, something important changes inside the mind. Rest stops feeling like escape and starts feeling like restoration. Instead of worrying about what is not being done, attention shifts to what is being restored. Energy begins to return without force. Thoughts become less scattered. Even motivation, which often disappears under pressure, begins to reappear. When the system is no longer overloaded, many people underestimate how much their performance is affected by lack of rest. They believe pushing harder will solve exhaustion, but often the opposite happens. The more pressure they apply, the more resistance they feel internally. Tasks take longer, mistakes increase, and frustration builds. What they need is not more effort, but more balance. And balance cannot exist without permission to pause. Allowing rest without guilt also changes the relationship with time. Instead of seeing time as something that must be constantly filled with productivity, it becomes something that can include silence, stillness, and recovery. This does not reduce ambition, it stabilizes it. A rested mind is more focused, more creative, and more capable of making clear decisions than a tired mind trying to force progress. There is also an emotional shift that happens when guilt is removed from rest. The mind becomes less harsh. The constant pressure to prove worth through activity begins to soften. This creates a sense of internal safety, where the person no longer feels like they must constantly earn their right to exist through productivity. Rest becomes part of living, not something that needs justification over time. This understanding builds a healthier rhythm. Tross clears throat, tross action followed by recovery, effort followed by pause, focus followed by release. And in that rhythm, both the mind and body begin to function with more stability without the constant feeling of being behind or incomplete. Progress and perfection often get confused in the mind, but they are not the same thing. Perfection is a fixed idea that demands everything to be flawless, complete, and without error. Progress, on the other hand, is a movement, a direction, a continuous improvement that does not require everything to be perfect in order to be meaningful. When a person focuses too much on perfection, they often become stuck. When they focus on progress, they begin to move forward even with imperfections. Many people struggle because they measure themselves against an impossible standard. They believe that unless something is done perfectly, it has no value. This mindset creates pressure that slows down action. Instead of starting, they delay. Instead of continuing, they stop to correct every detail. Instead of learning through experience, they wait for the perfect moment that never arrives. In this way, perfection becomes a barrier rather than a goal. Focusing on progress changes this relationship completely. It shifts attention from what is missing to what is improving. Even small steps begin to matter. A small improvement in skill, a slightly better decision, a little more understanding than yesterday. All of these become meaningful when progress is the measure instead of perfection. This creates momentum, and momentum is what keeps growth alive. Perfection creates fear of failure. Progress reduces that fear. When perfection is the goal, every mistake feels like a setback. When progress is the goal, mistakes become part of movement. A mistake no longer means stopping, it simply means adjusting. This makes action easier because the mind is no longer trying to avoid error at all costs. There is also a hidden cost to perfectionism. It often leads to burnout and frustration. When nothing ever feels good enough, satisfaction becomes impossible. Even achievements lose their value quickly because the focus immediately shifts to what is still not perfect. This creates a cycle where effort is constant, but fulfillment is rare. Progress breaks this cycle by allowing recognition of improvement, even if it is incomplete. When a person starts valuing progress, they begin to appreciate the process instead of only the outcome. Learning becomes more important than immediate success. Growth becomes more important than flawless performance. This mindset encourages experimentation. It allows people to try new things without the fear of being wrong. And through that experimentation, real development happens. Progress also builds confidence in a more stable way. Perfection-based confidence is fragile because it depends on never making mistakes. But progress-based confidence grows with experience. Every step forward, no matter how small, reinforces the belief that improvement is possible. Over time, this creates a deeper sense of capability that is not easily shaken by setbacks. Another important change happens in self-evaluation. Instead of asking, "Is this perfect?" the mind begins to ask, "Is this better than before?" This simple shift reduces pressure and increases motivation. It keeps attention on growth rather than judgment. It also makes long-term goals feel more achievable because they are broken into continuous steps instead of one impossible standard. Letting go of perfection does not mean lowering standards or ignoring quality. It means understanding that quality develops through repetition, correction, and experience. Nothing becomes strong in its first attempt. Everything meaningful is built gradually, and when this truth is accepted, the fear of starting begins to fade, replaced by willingness to continue moving forward, even when things are not fully complete over time. Focusing on progress creates a calmer relationship with achievement. Success is no longer defined by flawless execution, but by consistent movement. And in that movement, growth becomes sustainable, pressure becomes manageable, and improvement becomes a natural part of everyday life rather than an occasional event. Kindness towards yourself becomes real only when it is reflected in the way you treat yourself in the same situations where you would normally judge others with patience. Most people are naturally more forgiving toward others than they are toward themselves. When someone else makes a mistake, they often understand it, explain it, or give it context. But when they themselves make a mistake, the reaction becomes much harsher, more personal, and more emotionally intense. This imbalance slowly creates internal pressure that affects confidence, stability, and self-worth. Treating yourself with the same kindness you give others begins with awareness of this imbalance. It requires noticing how differently you respond depending on who made the mistake. If a friend failed at something important, you might say it is okay, that they can try again, that they are still capable. But when you fail, the internal response may become completely different, filled with disappointment, criticism, or even shame. Recognizing this difference is the first step in changing it. The mind often justifies this harshness by saying that self-criticism is necessary for improvement. It creates the belief that being strict with yourself will lead to better results. But in reality, Constant self-judgment does not create sustainable improvement. It creates emotional tension, and when emotional tension increases, clarity decreases. A person who is emotionally overloaded finds it harder to think clearly, make balanced decisions, and stay consistent in their actions. When you begin to treat yourself with the same kindness you offer others, something important shifts in your internal environment. The pressure decreases, the emotional high snorts weight becomes lighter. Instead of reacting to yourself with judgment, you begin to respond with understanding. This does not mean ignoring mistakes. It means changing the tone in which you process them. You still recognize what went wrong, but you do not attack your identity in the process. Kindness towards yourself also changes the way you recover from setbacks. Instead of staying stuck in self-blame, you begin to move towards solutions more quickly. A kind inner voice does not keep you trapped in the past. It helps you return to the present. And in the present, improvement becomes possible again. This ability to recover is one of the most important parts of emotional strength. There is also a deep emotional effect that happens when self-kindness becomes consistent. The mind begins to feel safer within itself. Instead of being a place of constant criticism, it becomes a place of support and reflection. This sense of inner safety reduces anxiety and increases confidence. Not because everything becomes perfect, but because mistakes no longer feel threatening to identity. When you extend kindness to yourself in the same way you extend it to others, your expectations become more realistic. You stop demanding perfection from yourself in situations where you would never expect it from someone else. You begin to understand that growth takes time, that learning involves mistakes, and that no one improves without moments of difficulty. This understanding reduces unnecessary pressure and allows natural progress to continue without interruption over time. This practice builds emotional balance. The inner dialogue becomes less aggressive and more supportive. The relationship with yourself becomes less about control and more about guidance. And harsh snorts, in that shift, life begins to feel less like a constant test and more like a continuous process of learning, adjustment, and steady growth. When all of these ideas come together, a simple truth becomes clear. The way you treat yourself determines the quality of your inner world. Not the world outside, not other people's opinions, but the quiet dialogue that continues inside your mind every day. When you stop speaking to yourself with harsh criticism, you create space for understanding instead of pressure. When you accept that mistakes are part of learning, failure stops being an identity and becomes experience. When you replace negative self-talk with supportive words, your mind begins to guide you instead of attack you. When you allow yourself to rest without guilt, you stop fighting your own human limits. When you focus on progress instead of perfection, movement becomes more important than fear. And when you treat yourself with the same kindness you give others, you restore balance to the way you see your own worth. These are not separate ideas, but different expressions of the same shift in awareness. A shift from judgment to understanding, from pressure to patience, from self-rejection to self-awareness. Nothing changes overnight, but everything changes through repetition. The way you speak to yourself today becomes the way you feel tomorrow. And the way you feel tomorrow becomes the way you live your life. And in that quiet space where your thoughts meet your actions, the most important relationship you will ever build is the one you have with yourself.